welcome to the Hunt Backcountry podcast. This is episode number 470, and it is part 2 of a conversation about rifles, calibers, bullets, and terminal performance. This conversation, these 2 episodes, really, it was one conversation that we split into 2 parts, both because of time, but also just because there's so much information to process. And if you haven't yet listened to part 1, be sure to do that before you dive into this conversation here in part 2. Today's conversation, we continue on the same topics and get even more specific with some practical examples of the concepts that we laid that foundation for in part 1. So we talk in today's conversation about the terminal performance and wound channel characteristics of different types or classifications of bullets, comparing the actual internal damage created by, say, a solid copper monolithic bullet compared to a tipped cup and core bullet such as an ELDX or ELDM, and an open tip, more match style bullet such as like a Berger VLD. We also talk about the relationship between impact velocity and bullet expansion or upset, the differences that could be expected from Steve shooting a 6mm Creedmoor this fall, whereas I am going to continue to shoot my 7 SAUM this fall, and also some other topics such as the mystique around shooting elk compared to, say, white-tailed deer, and how that has influenced gun writers, the media, and therefore marketing around cartridges, bullets, and more. So this is a great conversation. Once again, so much packed into this. We do have a recap of some of the key takeaways at the link in the show description for the Experience Project, where you can get some summaries and takeaways from this conversation, as well as links to additional resources. And there you can also contact us if you have a question, want to ask a clarifying follow-up, and we can look at doing more of that in the future. But right now, let's go ahead and dive into the second half of our conversation with Form. I want to try and tie this back to where we started.
When you circle back,
Yeah. We're better shooters if we have less recoil. And we're tying that to what you said earlier. If you can take a 1-inch rod, pass it through the vitals of an animal, it's going to die. It doesn't care what made that hole, what made that wound channel, whatever, right? So connecting those 2 dots. How does pick a bullet, pick a caliber, whatever, but let's pick on Steve, right? 6mm. This tiny little 103 or 108 that he may shoot this fall. How does that kill big game then? Because it's a tiny little bullet. And everybody says it's too small, doesn't have enough energy, whatever, which we've already talked about energy and dispelled that. But how is it penetrating and creating a wound channel?
Well, so when we go back to the measurements of a wound channel, which is penetration depth, temporary stretch cavity, etc. So, first off, it penetrates vital organs, so it pokes a hole in them, right? Could be a little hole, could be a big hole. So when you look at if it's a blood carrying organ, the heart or an artery or etc., then it pokes a hole and it lets blood leak out, which drops blood pressure. Okay. If it's the lungs, which most people go for, you let air in. So when we shoot an animal in the lungs, what we're creating is a pneumothorax. We're letting a sucking chest wound, right? You're letting air in the chest cavity, which collapses the lungs. So they suffocate, right? They pass out. So we have the penetration depth. There's a penetration depth we need. And kind of going back to the animal, that amount of penetration depth is not nearly what people think it should be or needs to be. If you take a 10-inch long rod and you put it in the front half of an animal from any angle, as long as that, when the bullet goes through the hide, the next thing it touches is ribs and then lungs. When it enters the cavity, as long as it touches lungs, 10 inches gets you to both. And I'm not recommending people shoot bullets and only get 10 inches of penetration in gel or whatever. It's just you don't need as much as people think you do. So we get sufficient penetration. Let's say sufficient penetration is 14 to 16 inches. That'll get you to the offside of any herbivore walking, except maybe a bison. And the only reason I say that is I haven't personally killed a bison. My guess is it works just fine. But so we get 14, 12 to 16 inches, 18 inches of penetration. Say 14 is an average. The wider the wound channel is for those 14 inches, the more tissue is destroyed, the faster blood loss happens, and the faster more air enters the chest cavity and they suffocate. So when you think about a wound channel, as long as the wound channel is what kills, so what produces the wound channel doesn't matter. What I try to get, like most people, they can visualize a wound channel is I take a rock and I'm over a really calm pool of water, your bathtub, whatever, and you throw the rock, right? So when the rock, from the moment it hits the surface of the water to touches the bottom of the pond or pool or creek, that depth is penetration depth. Okay. The water that physically touches the rock as it goes through the water is your permanent crush cavity. That is the tissue that is stretched, torn, pulped, bruised, destroyed permanently. It doesn't bound back and it doesn't heal itself quickly, right? It takes days to weeks to rebuild that tissue. The splash that you get, the ripples where the rock hits, that's your temporary stretch cavity. And tissue is elastic. Most of the tissue in living organisms, except for the brain, the spleen, the liver, the spinal cord, they're elastic. They're like a rubber band. They stretch on the passage of the bullet, from the passage of the bullet, the velocity, and they pop back. So if you don't, now that elasticity in tissue is expanded, it's exceeded, excuse me, depending on caliber, if we're just talking about velocity alone and not fragments, somewhere between 2,000 and 2,200 feet per second. So basically above that, you are going to get to the point where the tissue it expands outward from the velocity of the bullet at such a speed and distance that you start getting tearing just from that. Does that make sense? Because otherwise, if it impacts below that, the tissue just snaps back. Then you don't get any permanent damage from it. So the way that ELDM or ELDX that you just gave the example is the example is that's a fragmenting bullet. Okay, fragmenting is not a bad thing. Fragmenting is a very good thing from a killing perspective, as long as it's consistent and the bullet does penetrate deep enough. So actually, if you don't mind, let me kind of compare, because I think this is the way to do it. You said you were shooting a 127.65 bullet. Is that the Barnes LRX?
No, it's 125 grain Badlands
Okay.
bulldozer. Yep.
Okay, that's fine. So solid copper projectile, right?
Yep.
Now, have you ever recovered one of those bullets from an animal?
Yeah. So stuck in the offside hide. Yeah.
Well, so that's an interesting thing. What animal was that you caught the bullet in the offside?
Bull elk at 280 yards.
Okay, so that is interesting because a solid copper didn't guarantee an exit.
Correct.
Right. Of course, people will be like, it's a caliber thing. So what did the bullet look like?
The Badlands bullet's designed to shed its
Front part.
4 petals, and then it literally looks like a bull-nosed field point, and that's what I pulled out of the hide. Yeah.
Okay, so the kind of the hammer hunters, the hammer bullets, the bulldoze, the Badlands, those are kind of hybrid. They're fragmenting solid coppers. But to juxtapose the two bullets, you have an ELDM, ELDX on one hand, and let's say you use like a GMX, CX, or Barnes TTSX, TSX, or LRX, right? So designed to maintain 100% of its weight. So when that Barnes bullet goes through, you get some stretching from the expansion of the tissue radiating outward from the passage of the bullet. If it's sufficient velocity, so high velocity impact, you will get some tearing. But mainly all you get off of that bullet is the permanent crush cavity. Like a 1/2 to 1 inch hole through the animal. Which is where the term, like, if you've ever heard it, most people probably have, is like you can eat right up to the hole, right? It doesn't damage tissue because it's not fragmenting and creating a bunch of bloodshot and all that. That also means it's creating a narrower wound. The reason you can eat right up to the hole, in quotes, is because the bullet's not doing all that much damage. And that's regardless of caliber. That doesn't really come into play, especially
Yeah.
with this, because you're talking about a minuscule difference in width. So the difference is like an ELDM, ELDX is it gets its penetration through limiting how much it fragments. And you can think weight, but think more like the length of the bullet. And it is tied to weight on a lead bullet. But if a bullet is 2 inches long versus one that's 1 inch long and everything else is the same, I have more bullet to fragment with the 2 inch long bullet, right? It can peel itself off from the front, and yet it still has enough mass to continue the penetration. So heavy for caliber, that's what we really mean. We mean long for caliber, really, but heavy for caliber lead core match bullets, or the ELDX is quote unquote a hunting bullet. It is, but so are the other ones. When that hits, it immediately, the tip peels out, so it just squishes out. The plastic tip does. That exposes the open cavity in the nose. Fluid and tissue gets inside of that, and it starts expanding. I'm using quotes. It's upsetting, but there's nothing holding the lead and the jacket together. So it starts fragmenting outward. So it's hitting, and you've got the base of the bullet penetrating, and from the front, it's breaking pieces off. It's, you know what it is? It's like when you see a movie and a spaceship crashes through the atmosphere to Earth, right? It's burning through the atmosphere. You see chunks coming off the front, but the ship is so big it makes it to Earth mostly in one piece, right? Maybe it's missing the front half. That's what these bullets are doing. They're fragmenting from the front when you're talking about the ELDMs, ELDXs. And if you imagine the tissue is a rubber band and it gets stretched, when the bullet that doesn't fragment passes past that tissue, the rubber band just snaps back. It might be slightly torn in a couple of pieces, but it mostly just comes back and it looks like a rubber band. Now, if we stretch that rubber band out to its limit and then you touch that rubber band with a scalpel, it snaps, right? Because it's under tension, so it tears. Well, that's what bullet fragments do. That tissue is expanded and stretched out to its limit, and then these little fragments hit, and they cause fissures and tears and split the tissue, which is why you get quote unquote so much more bloodshot meat. It's actually not really muscle tissue that's bloodshot. It's mostly blood in the fascia, but you're damaging more tissue, so you get infinitely more or proportionally more blood in the tissue. You're causing more tissue damage. So when you look at that ELDM, ELDX, let's say it penetrates 16 inches. So anywhere in the front half, and the scapula doesn't do all that much to it, but you put that bullet anywhere in the front half and it makes it to the offside hide, and it stops on the offside hide. All right, that wound channel, at higher impact velocities, say 2,200 feet per second and above, the permanent wound channel will generally be about like a Nalgene bottle in width, pushed 16 to 18 inches deep. Can you guys see that?
Mm-hmm.
Not that there's a hole that big, but the circular circumference or the diameter of the permanently damaged tissue is about a Nalgene bottle wide. It can be bigger too. Well, that is going to kill faster than a 1 inch diameter rod pushed through, even if that 1 inch diameter rod exits, because you've damaged significantly more tissue, and you did it to tissue that they need to maintain life or locomotion, right? So the reason that bullet, ELDM, ELDX, work is because even though it's a small bullet, it's creating a very large diameter wound, and it's going deep enough.
At what point does it start fragmenting?
You mean like
Immediately?
what point in the animal?
Yeah. Sorry, like immediately, or 4 inches or 8 inches?
So that
Or,
goes back to neck length, right? So neck length is the depth of penetration from when it touches the animal till upset starts.
Mhm.
At higher impact velocity, so say like 23, 22 maybe, but really 2,400 feet per second, most of your plastic tip bullets, including ELDMs, ELDXs, TTSXs, etc., they have sub 1 inch neck length. And at the higher end of those impact velocities, it's unmeasurable. The neck length is 0. So it starts upsetting immediately. Where you do get a difference, even at higher impact velocities, is long, thin-nosed, open tip bullets, like hollow point boat tails. So think a burger. The reason why is because it it depends on the caliber, it depends on the shape of the nose, but in general, people think burgers like explode from the front, and they upset and expand like a normal bullet and fragment. And most of the time they don't. At high velocity, very high velocities, they do. But what really happens is when you look at that bullet on the inside, it's got lead in the back, it's got a very wide, long, open cavity in the front part of the bullet, and then the tip is almost completely closed. And what you're getting is that goes in, that tip has got to break off or a lot of times collapse in on itself. So imagine just putting the bullet, point up and pushing the tip down. So the tip goes down through the hollow cavity and then it tears it starts fragmenting almost from the inside out. What you get with that bullet is a neck length generally between 3 and 6 inches long. So you don't get upset and expansion and fragmentation with those style bullets in general until you've penetrated several inches. And then they generally rapidly fragment. So they turn to cornflakes if they're a thin J4 jacket. Jacket thickness plays a role. The density and hardness of the lead plays a role. If you interlock the bullet, so you do some mechanical or electrical lock or something, or a chemical lock with the jacket and the core, you limit expansion / fragmentation. But in general, most of the plastic tipped bullets they're upsetting very quickly. I mean, sub 2 inches in tissue.
Got it.
Well, this circles back to like a higher level concept, but you've mentioned velocity numerous times and how bullets behave differently at different velocity windows. How can velocity recommendations from bullet manufacturers be trusted? Right. So I see it a lot with
Man, you were going at it today.
Like, yeah, like they say, okay, it's gonna quote unquote expand down to 1,800 feet per second. But I've also seen very different pictures of what they mean by expansion, meaning on some bullets, like tougher bullets, it's expanding theoretically, just meaning that like the nose disrupted partially, right? But again, on this tough bullet with very minor disruption of the nose, it's barely going larger for caliber, and they're calling that expansion. So I know that just depends on bullet type. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about these lower velocity windows, because at the end of the day, since we've thrown out energy, that's what we're looking at to determine effectiveness of our cartridge with the bullet that we're shooting, right?
Yep. So it kind of ties into I'm unaware of any bullet manufacturer that states any bullet needs X foot-pounds of energy to open up or expand, because that's not a metallurgist or an engineer here, but so I might be stepping slightly out of my lane. But it's a sheer strength and a force thing. It's, for instance, in the same bullet line, they engineer them to do the same things or a certain thing at a certain impact velocity. So we were talking ELDX. Let's stay with that. So there's an 80 grain 223 or 224 diameter, 22 cal diameter ELDX. And there's a 270 grain 338 caliber ELDX, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. They upset the same way at the same impact velocity. So they both need plus or minus 1,800 feet per second to upset, according to Hornady's version of upset. Not saying that's right or not. I'm saying they consider both at 1,800 feet per second the same amount. That amount of upset is consistent between them. In other words, they're doing the same thing in the upset. They're expanding the same diameter, if you will. But the difference in foot-pounds of energy required for those two is ginormous. I mean, it's 500 foot-pounds of energy for the 22 cal to upset correctly. It's 1,800 feet per second for the 338 cal to up, or 1,800 foot-pounds of energy for the 338 cal to upset. I'm doing this by memory. I'm not looking at my phone. I'm not looking at an app. So we can't say you need 1,500 foot-pounds of energy, because in one gun, that's not enough to create bullet upset. So you're just going to get an ice pick. You're going to get you can get wounds that just look like a field point from an arrow or shot through them. But in another, that will tear the bullet completely apart. Right? So if I do 2,000 or 3,000 foot-pounds of energy with a 22 cal heavy fragmenting bullet, you're talking 4,000 feet per second in some of these cases. The bullet is just a varmint bullet at that point, like if it even makes it to the target. So energy doesn't tell us anything, because the 22 cal, the 6 millimeter, the 7 millimeter, 25 cal, 270, 30 cal, 338, in that line, they all require the same impact velocity. But foot-pounds of energy varies massively between them, because energy is just velocity and weight of the projectile. So there's a huge variable there. So when you look at it, they should be, in general, I mean, there's certainly exceptions, and this comes into the manufacturers aren't being open and honest with information about this. But it's not unreasonable for a lot of bullets to believe that the larger the caliber, the tougher the bullet is, quote unquote, because in enough cases, the manufacturer believes, well, if they're shooting a 338, they're shooting an elk or a moose, and they need a tougher bullet than if they're shooting 6 millimeter, they're shooting a deer or an antelope, so they need a softer bullet. But in general, they have the same impact velocity requirements in the same line of bullets. So not the manufacturer, the same line of bullets. As far as what expansion or upset, there again, we're just the industry has not been forthright and honest about it. You have one manufacturer that says if this bullet doesn't create a 3-inch wide wound when it hits, it didn't upset sufficiently, and they set their lower impact velocity to that level, right? You have another manufacturer that says if the nose disturbs at all, so less than caliber diameter, so the nose opens up less wide than the bullet is itself, they consider that expansion. Well, how does the consumer decide which is which, right? Which one is correct? And I kind of just gave the answer of which one is correct. It's a wound-based methodology, not a what the bullet looks like methodology. But so there's a huge variation between manufacturers there. And the lower the impact velocity gets, the less upset you get for any given bullet, right? So we look at impact velocity, that's what we're looking for, and we need to know what impact velocity causes bullet upset to the level we find acceptable. We as colloquial, you. Unfortunately, a lot of times it isn't necessarily that you can get it from the manufacturer, because you're not getting all the information. Because one, their version of expansion or upset is probably not yours, and two, their bullets fail. And the lower the impact velocity gets, the more they fail to upset. So you're getting the one that looks ideal, probably not. Hey, show me 35 bullets that were shot into media at this impact velocity. Show them all to me. If you did that, a lot of bullets that people like, again, it's not a naming thing. It's a bullet type, right? You take a solid copper, high weight retention bullet. Very few people would be happy with what they saw in the middle of an animal from that bullet. Most of the time, if you're talking below like 2,400-ish feet per second impact, it looks more like in the tissue, the bullet is something out of a cartoon. The nose is barely opened up. And then people will pull them out of, animals, and the bullet stops, right? You recover the bullet because velocity, it lost enough velocity due to resistance in the tissue because it opened up wide enough, or it lost enough weight. And then you catch it in the offside hide, because hide on the offside is like a trampoline. It's very elastic. It stretches. It's very hard to get through. And you go, well, look at the bullet. The bullet's beautiful. It went through 4 feet of animal, and this is what it looks like. And it's like, you understand that's at its max expanded diameter. The widest it ever was right before it, in a functional term, right before it stopped. So don't expect the bullet looked like that when I pulled it out, that it looked like that in the middle of the lungs.
Based off of your knowledge, taking ELDX, ELDM, I don't know what are other comparable bullets on the market. What's a good velocity that you want to impact velocity you want to hit with? Like, what's a good range?
Oh, I mean, what's the probability that you want? Like, nothing's 100%. So we
Mm-hmm.
can't say there's 100% of them open up at 3,000 feet per second. I mean, they do, but
Yeah.
there's no 100%. So do you consider 80% of them opening up and fragmenting somewhat? So
Yeah.
first
That's
off,
a.
I want to see a 1 inch wound. Like that's my like low limit. No matter what, I want a 1 inch hole bored through an animal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that's basically a solid copper bullet at the muzzle. You do get some tissue damage, but that's not a solid copper bullet at 500-yard impact velocity. So we start there. Not saying they don't kill. I've killed with solid copper bullets way further than 500. Just that's what I'm looking for. Anything bigger than that, up to about 3 to 5 inches wide wound channel. Once you get above that, things don't typically die any faster. You've created so much damage. It's just simply a function of physiology and like the animal suffocating. So I guess it would be what is your probability that it opens up sufficiently to create a 2 inch wide wound?
Yeah.
Um, for me, I want 85 to 90%. And with an ELDM, ELDX, that's about 1,800 to 1,850 feet per second.
Okay.
And again, it changes per bullet. You know what I mean? Like I've seen ELDMs and ELDXs come out at like just under 2,000 feet per second that look like a banana. They didn't open up at all. They yawed, they tumbled in tissue. Now they killed very well because a sideways bullet in tissue creates a massive frontal diameter, creates very large wounds. But you pull it out and you're like, well, the bullet failed. I don't know. The animal died pretty damn quick. Um, on the flip side, I've seen ELDXs come out at 1,400 feet per second that look like a Nosler AccuBond ad, right? This is the variability that we get. So it's just a probability of the variability, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
ELDMXs for me, I would like my lower. I would suggest lower limit being like 1,800 to 1,850 feet per second impact.
Okay. For me, that's useful information because I can back my cartridge choice down to mitigate recoil to, okay, at my max distance I'm ever going to shoot an animal, 500 yards. Uh, so then I can go look at a cartridge on the market and like what one produces 1,800 feet per second at 500 yards and go, bam, there you go.
Yeah, I mean that's so that kind of comes back to if we just look at like okay, the wound that's actually created in tissue is what does the killing, regardless of caliber or cartridge.
Mm-hmm.
Then we go, okay, for me, I want 14 to 16 inches of penetration for big game. I don't particularly care if it exits all the time on the offside. That it's better, it's like you choose, okay, maybe you get a blood trail, but you just had a solid copper that didn't exit. Ironically, I have caught far more Barnes TSXs in animals and AccuBonds than I have any match bullet, except a burger. Like ELDMs, ELDXs, I get more exits. Again, not talking like small numbers here, large data sets. I haven't caught many of either, but I've caught way more copper bullets, mainly because that front expands into a wider frontal diameter and it catches in the trampoline on the exit side. But for me, I want 14 to 16 inches of penetration, at least a 2 inch wide permanent crush cavity. And so I find the bullet that will give me that at the lowest impact velocity and the cartridge that has the lowest recoil to give me that impact velocity at my max range. So basically what you just said.
Mm-hmm.
So, and it's like we talk about bullets, and so let's use an example of one that if people have listened or they may have heard like the rock slide thread about 223s for deer, elk, bear, moose, and now brown bear and grizzly. That's not a joke and it's not like some clickbait nonsense. That was brought on by an individual that's in the medical industry, the trauma industry, who is very clinical about what he does, very logical, very fact based. And he took what we do, like with us, with 77 grain tipped match kings from Sierra. That's a bullet that was back up. I shouldn't say, I don't want to say it like that. That bullet creates an almost ideal wound profile from a 223. That's penetration depth and width. It's as wide as you can make a 5.56 223 bullet in wound channel, as wide as the wound channel can be and still penetrate 14 inches. So you look at that and you go, okay, that's an optimized 224 diameter bullet. Well, optimize a 30 cal bullet to get 16 inches of penetration, 14 to 16 inches of penetration. Then you make the bullet so it upsets or it creates the widest wound channel possible. That's where you get, you can't shoot animals with it. Like, you can't eat anything that's left. There's pictures on there where we have 30 cals and 338s maximized. And I mean, it's literally a basketball hole in the animal. Okay, so we don't want that. So what people do is they start choking the big guns down. They basically buy a V10 or a V8 race car, and they're like, oh my God, this thing's too powerful and I'm going to wreck it. So they go under the hood and they start yanking spark plugs out. That's what you do when you take bigger guns, bigger cartridges and calibers, and you shrink that bullet, that you toughen the bullet, right? What you're really doing is making the wound channel narrower, and you're taking performance away. So I can't do a 30 cal or a 338 maximized because the damage is just horrific. So why don't I pick the wound channel that I find sufficient to kill quickly, and then find the thing that recoils the least amount that gets me there the easiest? So I'm maximizing the smallest gun to the limit that it meets my definition of acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
And when you do that, that's where things like the 223 and the TMK, there's other bullets. That's just like think of like the pinnacle of the bullet for killing. When you do that, that wound is already too much. Most people, when they see a 223 in tissue with a TMK, the 77 grain TMK, the vast majority that we shoot that just said we were unethical pieces of crap when we start the hunt, by the time they see 3 or 4 animals, I mean, the first animal, they say it, they go, what the hell? That is too much. So if a 223 is already more than sufficient, it's too much tissue damage. What do I gain by going bigger? And there is some gaining to be there. Maybe it's longer range impact velocity or spotting your splash or impact or whatever. But from a tissue damage perspective, it doesn't get me anything.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, we've just had this mentality, whether it's Rourke or Hemingway or whatever, and it's use enough guns, shoot the biggest, baddest gun you can, the best or whatever, right? Shoot the biggest gun that you can well. But you don't say that in the rest of life, right? Like when you go into weightlifting, you don't say, hey, lift the heaviest, as a general rule day to day, lift the heaviest weight you possibly can, right? There's a performance aspect to it. I've been out of the archery game a little bit, but I don't think people say, hey, pull the absolute maximum bow weight that you possibly can and hunt with that. That's just bad, right? You need sufficient, and there's a range there. And the range is probably a lot wider and a lot lower than people think it is.
Yeah, it's human nature, like, especially man, bigger is better, right? Like bigger is better. And it's like, that's not, I mean, shooting a bow, I shoot a lighter pound bow. I go like 64 pounds because I know, like, when it comes into the mountains and awkward shooting positions, I want to be able to draw that bow smoothly and in, really awkward, leaning around a tree, leaning over the edge of a cliff. And I can't do that with 74-pound bow, right? And so you got to balance. Sure, I want that arrow going as fast as possible into the animal, but if that's at the expense of my ability to shoot that weapon, then I got to back off of that and find a good balance between the two. And I think we're talking about the exact same thing here with recoil, like, and it's even, I think, more so with a gun.
Oh, absolutely. And the thing is people, what they tend to do is they pick their maximum on like the most beautiful bluebird day. It's 62 degrees. There's a slight breeze. They got an overhang, a cement concrete bench, the freaking rabbit-eared leather shooting bench rest bags, or a lead sled, for Christ's sake. And they extrapolate that to being what they do.
Yeah, what their max range is.
Yeah, like all of it. That's what I do on demand, right? I mean, it's an interesting thing when we look at, like, you can put optics behind scopes to see what people's wobble zone is and actually measure that with lasers. So I know, like, hey, from a bench rest, you have a 0.12 maximum wobble zone. That's how much the barrel's moving on a target, 0.12 MOA, or whatever. You can measure. So I know what my actual wobble zone is. I know what compared to like a Wiseman return to battery, 10,000 pound rest, so it returns to battery within like a thousandth of an MOA. 100 shot group size with that. I know what I shoot that same gun, human firing from sandbags are. I know what I shoot that gun from a backpack. So we have all this, like, and the difference between the machine and me shooting is, and for this is most shooters, if you don't flinch and you're shooting from sandbags, you're within a quarter MOA or less of 100 round shot group sizes of a machine. It's not, now most people flinch, so that's a problem. But if you don't, that's not a thing, right? So we say that, and then we go, okay, we take optimum. So I know that I take, trying to think of the gun I'm shooting now that I actually have the data on. So I have a 6XE, so like a 6 Creedmoor. It's a little bit heavier. It's like 11 pounds suppressed and everything. So that gun's 50 shot cone, machine fired, is right at 1 MOA. Okay, so 50 shots in a 1-inch dot at 100 yards, 1 to 1.1, 1.2, somewhere in there. There's a range. My 50 shot cone with that gun from a bench is 1.1 to 1.2. It's a tenth of an MOA larger. Okay, when I go into the field, even with a backpack or a good front rest, it's a 1.5 MOA field shooter. So my group size opens up approximately to 1.5, approximately half MOA over the baseline of the gun. But I give that same gun to someone else, they go, oh, they can shoot it for 1.1 MOA for 30 round groups on the bench, which, by the way, is like teens for 3-shot groups on average, right? Just one hole. Take them into the field and they're a 4 MOA shooter. So there's an issue there, right? But they will go from the bench and think that's what they're going to do in the field. And so we have there's a problem on a fundamental belief of what we think we can do and what we actually can do on demand. So that's a big one. And then again, as we go back to the beginning, everything that moves the gun more or affects our movement of the gun, every incremental increase in that is a corresponding, and usually it's not a 1-for-1. It's a cascading effect of a detriment to our performance. So it isn't like, oh, well, I lose a quarter MOA going from, field shooting groups from, something that recoils 10 foot-pounds like a 6 mil to something that recoils 20 foot-pounds like a 7 mag. No, it's every slight error increases it dramatically, right? So it's not like I lose a half MOA. It's like, dude, you could be shooting 5 MOA, and not even realize it.
Mm-hmm.
Steve, what your 6mm Creedmoor, which I know you're not even like fully finished setting it up, what approximate muzzle velocity would you have with like that 103 or 108?
2850. I'm running a super short 16-inch barrel.
That's what I'm talking about.
All right. So if I put in a 103 ELDX with 2850, set some like low level altitude pressure stuff. So not like optimized for high elevation.
What we're actually doing. Yeah.
Yeah. So that would carry actually perfect. So it's 600 yards. It hits exactly 1850 velocity. And we talked before about ELDX, going down to that range, right?
Mm-hmm.
Foot-pounds of energy is only 782, only because, that matters a lot. We talked about that. So Steve has a 600-yard gun for hunting caribou, moose, mountain goat, easy in Alaska this fall. Agree?
Oh, absolutely. The gun is, absolutely.
The gun is, right. That's all. I don't care about Steve.
It's never going to be my fault. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So it's always my fault, unfortunately.
We've talked, and I'm just like trying to bring things back to practicality. So for him, I'm going to go on 2 of those same 3 hunts with Steve. I'm not changing anything in my setup this year just because I'm used to it and everything else. So I'll be shooting a short 7 SAUM with a 175 grain ELDX.
Okay.
So if we pick Steve's max range and say it's 600, again, terminally, not skills.
Yep.
And both of us, Steve and I are there, we're shooting 1, 2, 3, we each shoot He's shooting a 103 LDX. I'm shooting a 175. Do you have any more confidence in me being terminally effective if we put it in the vitals than him?
Oh, absolutely not.
Okay.
You would if you shot 100 animals just like that at the same impact velocity. If you shot 10, you lay them all out, you show the video of the animals being shot, but you don't tell people what they're shot with, you would be 50-50. They would be at exactly random chance of picking which was which. You wouldn't be able to tell the difference. The wound channel size between that 103 and that 175 is about an inch in diameter in tissue. So your temporary stretch, your maximum permanent crush cavity, right? So the actual permanent tissue damage is going to be about 2 to 2.5 inches wide in diameter on average with that 6 millimeter, and about 3 to 3.5 with a 7 millimeter.
Okay.
But that's on average. So you're going to get some of those 6 millimeter bullets are going to create a 6 inch wide wound, and some of the 7 millimeter bullets, for whatever reason, are going to create a 2 inch wide wound.
Mm.
So it takes a lot of animals to see the difference between basically anything from 22 cal well-designed bullet and a 33-38 cal well-designed bullet, but not truly optimized, right? I mean, we start talking sintered fragmenting projectiles in a 338, right, that have 0% weight retention at 10 inches. Yeah, you can see the difference. But when we're talking like ELDXs, ELDMs, most common hunting bullets, you can't see the difference. You can't see it. You'd have to have so many data sets to see it that it becomes impractical.
What if we did the same thing? Steve's shooting his 103 ELDX. I'm shooting my 7 SAUM. But I moved to I want to say 155 grain hammer, only because I've shot it, not because I'm picking on
Mhm.
hammer. So if we take them out of the equation, and I said, okay, let's stick with Hordney, I'm going to shoot a 160 grain CX mono.
Mhm.
Do you like any more or less be like, oh, Steve's going to do better here out of 10?
There's no comparison when seen in large numbers between those. The 6 millimeter 103 ELDX kills faster, more often with less distance traveled in the animal, and they stay on their feet shorter periods of time. By far. That CX at 1,800 feet per second, which is going to be a shorter range, by the way, because it's got a lower BC. It's going to be a lower impact velocity at the same range because of the lower BC than the 175 ELTX. That's going to creates a wound that's somewhere between less than thumb size to pinky size. So now you've taken, by bullet choice, you have taken a wound from Nalgene bottle width to the top of a Pepsi bottle, like plastic Pepsi bottle cap. Now, granted, some shots are going to create more damage. I'm not saying that. On average, that's what you've done. Sub 1 inch wound.
So I think if we were to start 2 hours ago or however long this has been and say, like, okay, so same scenario. We're both going on a mountain goat hunt in Alaska. Mountain goat animals are tough to kill. We've talked about that. We've talked about why. Steve's going to take a tiny little 6 millimeter and shoot a 103 ELDX. Mark's going to take his 7 millimeter Magnum because he's a real man.
Mhm.
Oh, and by the way, mountain goats are tough. So Mark's going to shoot a tough bullet like a 160 CX. Almost everybody would have said, oh, well, Steve's an idiot. Mark's, a genius.
Mhm.
But that's not at all true after listening to you for 2+ hours.
Well, it's not at all true if you look at the wound channel. If you kill them and you lay them side by side, everybody would say that the 6 millimeter wound was created by the 7 millimeter, and they'd look at the 7 millimeter wound and go, "That's why you shouldn't shoot a 6 millimeter."
That's all. I'm just trying to like bring 2 hours into like a very real practical. You probably thought this way. Now 2 hours later, I'm not saying you should think the other way, but I think we've explained why you could think.
So again, death/incapacitation comes from tissue damage. Tissue damage is determined by how the bullet works, regardless of caliber. So I can make a bullet create almost basically any wound I want, regardless of caliber, by engineering it correctly. If we can follow along and we agree with that, right? The bullet doesn't know whether it was hit by a 33 caliber or a 6 millimeter. It just cares the wound that is created. Then we need to go, okay, is it possible to make smaller bullets create the same size wounds, or sufficient wounds, more than sufficient? When I say sufficient, I mean dramatically more than sufficient, right? A 1-inch broadhead creates a sufficient wound to kill an animal. I don't want broadhead wounds when I shoot a rifle. I want rifle wounds. So I'm looking for something like a 20-ounce Coke bottle or larger in diameter wound channel, permanent, at the lowest impact velocities. So if we can follow along with that, just a logical trait, then the question is it possible to make smaller bullets create those wounds? This is where you don't have to trust anybody. The evidence is out there. In that 223 thread and a 6mm thread on Rock Slide, I just use them because they're the best conglomerate and combination and collection of actual data-driven pictures and wound channels that exist, including poor shooting. The answer is yes. It is completely and totally possible to make way more than sufficient depth of penetration and wound channel size with the smallest practical guns that exist. It's just how the bullet is designed and how it's engineered and made. That's it. And that's probably like the best thing that could come out of this is if I could get people to stop saying foot-pounds of energy has anything to do with tissue damage, because it does, but not in comparison. It's a metric, but it doesn't. It's like saying how fast a bullet moves in light years. Well, it doesn't really matter because it doesn't tell me anything about what it does, right? It's not a usable number. Foot-pounds of energy isn't a functionally useful number. Stop saying that and then go what the bullet does in tissue, the wound channel size and depth. That's how they kill. If you do those two things, you're 80% of the way to understanding terminal ballistics. But those are the two hardest things to get people to let go of because they've been told their whole life that's not true.
And Mark, like you take your 7 SAUM and you shoot 100 mountain goats, attempt to shoot 100 mountain goats, or you take the 6 Creedmoor and attempt to shoot 100 mountain goats. I think the goal here is to prove, in the mountains, hanging over the edge of a cliff, high, like whatever, high degree of difficulty shots, poor positioning. You're gonna, form, according to you, what, double your chance of a kill shot?
No, it's more than that. So that's perfect. I meant to say this earlier in my little butterfly squirrel zone. I forgot. So this didn't, like me and us shooting smaller bullets, smaller calibers didn't come in a vacuum. So I was taught, the people that taught me how to hunt, a 7mm Remington Magnum was marginal for 90-pound southern whitetails. A 243, 30-06, and 270 is almost irresponsible. That's how this group thought. Good 90-pound, 100-pound whitetail rifles shot at 30 and 40 yards in the woods started with 300 Win Mag. And you're better if you could shoot a 338 Win Mag. Okay, that's where I grew up. So let me do the math. 98 of the first 100 deer I killed with a rifle were with 300 Win Mag or 300 Rum or 300 Weatherby. Might have been a 3378 Weatherby thrown in there too. Okay, I had two 30-06s in there. I was indoctrinated into magnums. That's what you need. The difference is the group I shot with, I was just talking with a dude, is, there's cultural differences when you go out. In the Southeast at that time, you had the stereotypical, a lot of people just had their rifles bore-sighted at the shop and never shot a live round. They just went and hunted with it like that. And deer are large, and at 30, 40 yards, you bore-sight a rifle, you're probably going to hit deer in the chest. But a lot of people miss, a lot of wounded, right? The group that I grew up with, all the people that we knew except for this smallish group, nobody actually zeroed their rifles every year. This group did. They just zeroed them at 25 yards. So when we talk about the technical competence of like shooting and zeroing a gun, we were far ahead. The people that taught me were far ahead from the other people we were around just because they actually checked their zero at 25 yards every year by hitting an inch target. But even still, in that group of like 10 dudes, which would average somewhere between 6 and 20 deer a year killed per person, so 100-ish deer for that small group, 150, there's probably 30 deer that were gut shot or leg shot out of those 150 shots, or 150 to 200 animals. And we're talking that 30 to 50 yard shooting range, not 200, 300, 400 yards. Where I got into the smaller guns is because I was trying to teach somebody how to hunt, and they were extremely recoil adverse. They weren't at first. They were shooting a 300 Win Mag, just like my gun, Then they got slightly kissed by the scope, and that was it. They could not do it. And so we went out, we got a 243, and I'm like freaking out because I've already killed several hundred deer at this point, but mostly everything with big magnums. And I'm like, this is going to be bad, right? The deer aren't going to die, blah, blah, blah. We bought like Winchester Super X or something bullets. She shoots a deer. They're in the chest at close range, like 40 yards. It drops. It gets back up. I'm thinking like I'm shooting, grizzly bears or a Cape buffalo. Like I've got to put this thing down. It's going to run off. So I shoot it with a 300 Win Mag, and it drops. And I'm like, that's why we shoot magnums. In the wound channel from the 243, it just wasn't anything impressive. And then so we changed bullets, and we do like Remington core locks or something. Like one was Federal, one was Winchester, just standard soft points. She shoots another spike. Shoots a spike a few days later. This is like 100 yards, and the deer drops like instantly. It just flops, but it's alive, and it turns into this whole thing where like she's emotional. I'm trying to shoot it with a pistol to kill it. It's just this disaster basically, right? And I'm cursing the 243 up and down, never thinking that like this deer was in a full on rut chase, middle of the rut, fighting, had just got done fighting another smaller buck. He's amped up, right? And the deer dropped. I get online and I look for bullets, and what kept coming up was 95 grain Nosler ballistic tips. It happened so much time. We went to Walmart, we bought that ammo, we re-zeroed. Of the next, I think it was 48 deer over the next 2 years, 47 of them dropped on the shot and were done. And what we also noticed is we went 40-something deer without a bad shot between her and I. Like, whereas with the 300 Win Mags, we were still wounding 1 to 3 deer out of 10, like poor shooting. And that's what started the like, oh, bullets matter. And why aren't we having these gut shot and poorly shot deer? And this is not like something proud. This is just reality of like growing up in the South where people shoot deer and nobody taught you how to do it. That wounding happens a lot more when you kill a lot of animals. Fast forward 15 years or so, and one of my buddies that I work with was asking about using a 223, a 5.56 on deer. And I'm like, I'm super uncomfortable with that, marginal, like 243 is really good, and he called me on my shit, and he's like, but I thought we just figured out and went through this whole thing that there's no real difference between 5.56 and 7.62 on living things. And I just had to sit there and go, okay, well, damn. So that afternoon I went and took the 223 out, killed a deer. Couldn't tell the difference. Like I killed 7 in a week. They all died just like they did normally. And that wasn't TMKs. That was like Spirit Gold Dots, Federal Fusions. So just a good, relatively bonded bullet. We used them a lot. We still limited range because we're gaining experience, etc. We killed, 60, 70 deer the first couple of years, maybe more. With 5.56, what we were noticing were, well, first off, we're not gut shooting or poorly shooting animals anymore. Like, everybody is hitting deer in the chest, and they're doing it. They're not picking their shots. They're shooting the same shots they always have. Then the 77 grain tip Match King came out. That's when the light really changed, because we went from like harder bullets designed to penetrate to one that was designed to create the most tissue damage possible while getting sufficient penetration. And our use skyrocketed. Hundreds of animals over the next couple of years, including elk, bear, moose. And what I can say is, to this day, when we take different people and we go hunt with a lot of people, I hunt with as many people as I can because I want to get the data off of it, right? And we average, for all these people from beginners to world class, between 10 and 30% of shots with guns that recoil in that 20 foot-pound range, so like magnums. Even when you break them, you got to deal with the muzzle blast. So it almost just offsets it. Yes, there's less recoil, but there's a lot more muzzle blast. We average 10 to 30% are poor shots. And that's from 100 yards to as far as anyone could ever imagine shooting at an animal. And people will laugh and scoff at that. And I go, well, I don't know what to tell you, because when you talk to guides, what they tell you is the vast majority of hunters that come in wound the hell out of animals. They wound them and miss them. And it's this dirty little secret in hunting. We're not as good as we think we are. What I can tell you, so we go from that 10 to 30%, say average of 20% of animals are poor shots on them, even at normal ranges. We went over 200 animals with a 223 from muzzle contact to over 600 yards before we had the first poor shot. And it was a very simple, like, rush shot at a little over 400 yards, and it shot low and broke the leg. They followed it up 20 minutes later on the antelope and killed it. We still, to this day, in culling and all of this, we average over 200 animals per poor shot with a 5.56, sub 550-ish yards, because you're starting to lose impact velocity past that. But when we juxtapose over that, and I go, okay, all these people are killing deer, elk, bear, moose on demand. They're not shooting an animal that they would shoot it with any other cartridge. They're taking the shot, and yet we have a 1% failure rate in shooting, which also means success rate on the animal. How do I look at that data and go, no, you should be shooting a 300 Win Mag where you have a 30% failure rate? If we take the caliber out of it and the emotion, it doesn't make sense. You go to the thing that has the highest success rate, and everything in real life is proving out what you see on the range and what you see in testing. Is that as long as that wound channel is sufficiently deep and wide, the less the gun moves, the better everybody does. And so, like, for me, it wasn't in a vacuum. I started very much on the other side, that you need to be shooting a 300 rum, with the biggest, heaviest bullet with a 34-inch barrel and the most velocity. And the only reason it ever changed is because we killed enough and saw enough killed that I'm like, well, the success rate is demonstrably higher with less recoil.
For myself, everyone listening, if we go back to this idea of our experience, as good as it may be, you could be hunting for 20, 30 years and kill a couple animals over that time, like each year, which very few people listening to this have probably done that. That's still a relatively small sample size, right? Like, at the end of the day, we have to approach this with some humility and like open-mindedness, because our experience, whether it's been really positive or really negative with a really big caliber or a small, like, it almost doesn't matter, because individually, our own experience is valuable because it's our experience, but it's still, for 99% of the people listening to this, a relatively small sample size. And so it's weird to have like emotions tied to your own experience when your own experience isn't that much experience, even if you think you have a lot of experience, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and usually it's because people's experience, and again, I know this can be hard because it can sound different, and this isn't like arrogance or opinion or ego talking. I don't have any ego about any of this. Like, I fail. I don't care to admit that. We all make mistakes. We're all wrong at times. I just try to present data of what we actually see. And the reason that even if you hunt a long time, that people's experience isn't as applicable as they think it is because mostly they use the same things over and over and over again, the same categories of things, and they don't see enough they don't experiment, right? And they're not logging it. So it's an emotion-based response to what happens. So you can say you have a lot of experience and but if the smallest thing you've ever shot an elk with is a 7 mag or a 270 with a Barnes bullet, and you shoot everything else with 30 cal and 338, and your brain says, well, I shot it with a 30 cal and it ran 200 yards with a chest shot. If I'd have shot it with a 243 and a good bullet, it would have ran a mile. That's not how it works, right? But you don't know that because you haven't done it. I didn't know that when I started because I hadn't done it until a dude called me on it. And then what did I do? I didn't throw up a bunch of walls about how, like, well, for this reason I'm correct. I said, oh, okay, let's go try it. And we had enough, I don't want it to sound callous, but we had enough targets to do that. And then once I got the data size, it's like, dude, I was wrong. I was incorrect about this. And that's the issue. And then when we kind of get in echo chambers as hunters where shooting small guns at animals is not a new thing. I've got a book called Wolfman. I think it's called Wolfman of Alaska. And like, he thought this is like in the 20s and 30s. He thought the greatest killing gun that he had ever had was a 220 Swift with a 50 grain or 45 grain varmint bullet, except on a brown bear. But he killed everything with that. I don't know if you guys have read it. I just started it. This is 100 years ago. He said that. Now imagine if you went back and you had the bullets we have now, which are actually designed to penetrate deep enough, and you get the same thing. So this isn't like, this groundbreaking stuff. It's just, it's gotten smashed down by the weight of conventional writers. And I think it's worth saying this. I think the reason is because rightly or wrongly, we established this mythical quality to animals, right? Because part of the allure of shooting an elk, it's a big thing in your life for most people. They come from the east, the north, the west, whatever. They shoot an elk. It's a big deal. It's their version of a dragon. And if same thing with a bear. I mean, bear are the exact same thing. They're just more of that. If in reality you understood that it's just a big deer, dude, it's a big southern whitetail. That's all it is, and it's not even that much wider. From the killing perspective, it's not that big of a deal. As soon as you do that, all the mystique goes away, and it's like you to be kind of a jerk about it. You can't be a great white hunter if you're just shooting, whitetail does over a corn feeder in the South. And from a killing perspective, that's all it is. The hunting is different, right? The searching for the animal is different. And I think that's one of the reasons that the writers, not I think, talking with them, that seems to be a thing, is they have to pump it up and sensationalize it because that's what draws views and that's what gets people purchasing things. If people knew that they could take their Texas whitetail rifle and kill an elk, it kind of loses some of the mystique and excitement of shooting an elk.
Fascinating.
Along those lines, and we talked about it multiple times, there's so much bad information out there that's not based on real data and science.
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest, not to go down that path, but the scientific community hasn't done themselves a whole lot of benefit ever, but over the last decade, because they get biased just like everybody else and they let it come through. So then you get people, which understandably that I talk to, that are like, you mention science or labs or research and they immediately tune out. I can't really blame them, except don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Doing things correctly in the quote unquote scientific method correctly is how we get to a better spot. So, all of this isn't, we said it, like, I'm not trying to convince anybody to shoot a 223 or 6 mil. I don't care what you shoot, man. I'm shooting a freaking 300 Win Mag yesterday or day before because I like the gun, right? I mean, I shoot a couple thousand rounds, several thousand rounds of big magnums a year because in some cases I have to, and in some cases just because I like the rifles. But I can be honest about why I'm doing what I'm doing, right? When we look at Ryan or we look at Jake from Unknown, Jake he's smart, he's got experience, but he doesn't have experience with smaller guns. But maybe he comes out to the conclusion that he just likes hunting with a 300 RUM. Okay, but there's a difference between saying I hunt with it because I like it and, well, I hunt with it because smaller doesn't work. Like, we just be honest about it, right? Like, we can have likes and dislikes without trying to be dishonest about what the performance difference is. If we remove the emotion, we come to a better place.
I think it's important to note here, Form, as you've mentioned, like everything works. I can look at my own results from shooting animals over the last few years with a 125 grain solid copper bullet. Like everything I've pointed at and shot has died and died fairly quickly. But it's still a small sample size. And I think the goal of recording this podcast with you is to understand that, we want to optimize that, and making our own decisions off small sample sizes isn't the best thing to do. So yeah, just from your perspective, maybe talk about that a little bit of, matching the bullet to what you want and understanding that, everything works, but there's certainly bullet choices that are better than others.
Yeah. So I guess once we come to like, look, unless we don't want the front half of an animal, if we shoot the front half, we don't want that much damage, then the caliber really doesn't have that much play into it, right? Regardless of bullet type. So we remove the caliber piece and we just talk about like bullet styles or performance differences. I don't know why. I guess it's because people want to have like a boogeyman that they can point to. Solid copper bullets kill. I mean, That's like saying a 1-inch diameter broadhead doesn't kill. Of course it does. And then people will go, oh, well, they kill differently. No, they don't. They damage tissue. That's how they kill, is they damage tissue. The mechanism is slightly different, but it's the result is the same. So it's not that, a solid copper bullet doesn't kill. It's that it damages less tissue, which can be a good or a bad thing. I mean, it's a bad thing from speed of incapacitation on average. It's a good thing for meat damage and meat loss. There's some well, I'm going to take really horrible like going away shots, so I want more penetration. I just don't do that. But in other words, there's nothing particularly wrong. I mean, there's nothing wrong with choosing a narrow wounding, deep penetrating bullet. You just have to understand what you're getting out of it. So if somebody doesn't want a lot of meat damage, pick a bullet that produces a narrow wound. Just understand what you're getting. On average, the animal is going to stay on its feet longer. That's all it is. And if you make a poor shot, like in the guts, etc., you don't have the width of the wound and fragments to damage more tissue. When you look at like margin of error, the wider that wound channel is, the more margin for error you have, which is almost solely, not solely, but primarily driven by bullet construction, not by caliber. So, we talked about like small guns and stuff. When I like doe antelope, when we shoot doe antelope or whitetail does for meat, I want as much meat as I can get off of them. I mean, that's what they're for. And I don't particularly care if they run 150 yards. It's in the open, right? And I'm not pushing low impact velocities. I like Barnes bullets. I mean, I like solid copper bullets for that. It's not damage as much tissue. They do move more, but that's okay. But for every other aspect, I want them to die faster. So, like, there certainly isn't. I know y'all aren't, but this is not saying that your Barnes CX hammer, whatever, doesn't kill. It's just they wound less tissue than other types of bullets, so they kill slower, if that makes sense.
And you're over 100 animals. If you shot 100 with one and 100 with the other, you're gonna recover 10 to 20% less, something like that. I mean, like you said, you hit it in the guts, and you're just not going to find that animal.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly less. I mean,
yeah.
It kind of goes in, because the other thing you get with bullets is people go, well, what about quartering 2 shots or quartering away? Well, quartering 2 is nothing. If there's nothing in the front half of a herbivore or a bear that stops a bullet, any of these bullets we're talking about, that's demonstrably true. There's reasons, if you guys want to go into why it seems to be that people think bullets are splashing on shoulders. I'm certainly happy to with anatomy. The answer is they're not. You're not actually hitting where you think you are. But you get the I want to shoot an elk in the butt as it's going away from me. First off, don't do that. You're trying to hit a small target. There's no guarantee. There's no bullet made that can guarantee to get through the stomach with the quote unquote grass bag and all of the hay and grass that's packed in there. That's a perfect bullet stopper. However, if you were going to, having seen it done quite a few times on elk and a bunch on deer, you really want the bullet that fragments and create the widest wound, because you have a better chance of disrupting the rear end. Yeah, that's not me saying do that. It's just, even in that instance, I don't, from a performance aspect and a successful recovery, I don't want the harder, deeper penetrating bullet. I want the one that does the most tissue damage.
One thing I always appreciate is just very practical recommendations, so especially at the end of something like this where it's challenging what I accepted to be true. So do you got top 3, like rifle off some bullets that perform well on a consistent basis?
Sure. I mean, again, what wound channel do we want?
Yeah, I think
in general, go ahead.
As I say, something in the ELDX, ELDM range.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
not aware of other bullets on the market that are similar in performance.
So for something like that, so we're talking a fragmenting style bullet. Relatively speaking, a fragmenting, that's not a dirty word. That's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
ELDX, ELDM, heavy for caliber. So we want to look for heavy for caliber because they do make light for caliber ELDMs as well. I hate saying this because it's just going to drive more of the scarcity of them. Heavy for caliber Sierra tips Match Kings are absolutely phenomenal killing bullets. But they're rare, and quite frankly, you have to kill a lot of animals to really see a difference between them and the ELDM, ELDX. Performance wise, I hate to say it because there is some issues there sometimes, but Accubon long ranges, Nosler ballistic tips, Hornady SSTs, new SSTs that used to be very thin jacketed and expanded, fragmented really heavily. Kind of your standard. All the bullets, regardless of label, if they're a cup and core, so a core, lead core, and a jacket, a copper jacket with a plastic tip, unless there's something wildly different about them, they all perform really similar. I mean,
Okay.
most of your match bullets have thin jackets all the way to the base, so they fragment more. A lot of the hunting bullets have like a taper jacket that gets thicker as it goes to the base, so it resists expansion or fragmentation. Um, Relatively speaking, they're all about the same though. I prefer like rapidly fragmenting because I get the depth of penetration I need from the weight of the projectile. That there's more mass to fragment off, so I get the width by fragmenting heavily. And all in all, like when people ask like what bullet, I, like it or not, Hornady has really they kind of made the easy answer just get an ELDX. Like it's not my favorite bullet on a personal level, but it kills really well. It's very consistent. I don't. The reason why you get some of these bad stories, and I can't say that they're all false, right? I can't say that every dude that says he got 5 inches of penetration is false with an ELDX. Although in thousands of test shots and hundreds of animals, and the way the bullet's designed, it starts to boggle the mind how you could have several people say they had the same thing, just giving probabilities of it. But that bullet it's pretty well designed to go from high impact velocity to lower impact velocity.
Do you mind sharing why it's personally not your favorite? Or is that too like just controversy and opinion?
No. It's why the TMK is. Um, so this gets into a little bit more esoterical or more details of them. So the shape of the wound channel, what I want is a very wide football. In other words, think of a wide football instead of a basketball. Or a very long football, if you think of it that. An elongated wide wound versus a very wide round wound. And a varmint bullet, like a true varmint bullet, and some burgers at very high impact velocities have more of that round wound shape when you're looking at it from the side. So they create a massively wide wound, but they have no trailing in, like there's no part to the bullet that continues. Versus more of like uh, a sideways triangle, right, where it tapers down a little slower, and you have a tail that comes off of it. The main reason isn't for normal hunting ranges why I prefer a TMK over an ELDX or ELDM. I shoot a lot of animals at low impact velocities. I'm not saying that's right or wrong, morally or whatever. I'm not saying that. It's just what it is. And what you get with an ELDM, and ELDX is a little different because it has a taper jacket, but the TMK has a thicker jacket for an equivalent bullet as an ELDM, and to an extent the ELDX. So the jacket is slightly thicker. So at high impact velocities, it creates a little bit deeper penetration than an equivalent ELDM, and about the same as an ELDX. Now, normally at low impact velocities, that would be bad because the TMK in this instance would resist upset more than the thinner jacketed ELDM or ELDX in the front half. The difference is when you section those bullets, the tip comes in, so it looks like an arrowhead being stuck into a cane arrow, basically, like when you were a kid. The base of that plastic tip, the leg, goes into the tip of the bullet on an ELDM, ELDX, and the lead almost completely surrounds that pin of the bottom of the plastic tip, right? The arrowhead base. So when the plastic tip comes out, it's less, you have like a narrow opening in the tip and a lot of lead supporting the front of the bullet. You go to a TMK, it's got a much larger air gap around that tip of the plastic tip. So when the plastic tip comes out, it's a wider surface for the front of the bullet to start upsetting and fragmenting. So what you get is at higher impact velocities, like 2,000 feet per second and above, a TMK and an ELDX is pretty similar, relatively similar, and an ELDM is pretty close as well. When you get below that, you get a little bit deeper penetration at higher impact velocities than the ELDM because of the thicker jacket, a little bit more of an oval shape or a football shape wound. But at low impact velocities, the bullet fragments easier because of the larger opening in the front of the bullet. So, whereas like an ELDM, ELDX is like 1,800 feet per second, I'm going to like just kind of hit the table and say, hey, if you're shooting a TMK, keep it above that as well. I also just want to be honest. We haven't found the lower limit to a TMK. So 77 grain TMKs, 95 grain TMKs, and 130 grain 6.5 TMKs down to below 1,400 feet per second have full and consistent upset. I don't mean the bullet looks pretty. I mean the wound channels are fantastic. I'm not telling anybody or suggesting that anybody should shoot an animal at 1,600 feet per second impact. I'm just trying to be honest about the data.
Mm-hmm.
So where I get a little iffy at that 1,750 to 1,800 feet per second with an ELDM, ELDX, zero issues with bullet performance from a TMK.
And is this like, I know this has been a while since we've brought this up, but is this a situation where the TMK is so effective at creating wound channels, it's actually too destructive for most people's tastes in a larger caliber, right? So I know they make a 167 millimeter. It would just be a mess.
It's nasty. Yeah, that's the problem. So we've done a few with the 160s. And when I say a few, keep in mind I'm talking about a statistically relevant sample size here. So we've done a few. We've done quite a bit with the 195 30 cal. I don't want to be too graphic. If you hit a deer in the opposite scapula, you can totally separate the arm, that entire quarter, from the animal. Like, it's off the animal. It's a nasty bullet. Not that we don't use them. There's certainly a case for it, but it's just different. I mean, when like 6.5, 130 and below, the 7 millimeter 160. I mean, for me, I shoot. There's a place for magnums. There's a place for really big guns. For me, that's extremely long range, and I mean extremely. Far enough that nobody should be shooting that far is quite frankly what it is. Big guns, it's not the hit rate that's better. It's that when they miss, they throw up more splash or grass and dirt, so you see impacts.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see trace wear. That's where I use them for. That's what the group we hunt with uses them for when it starts getting that. When we're talking your legitimate, normal, long range hunting, everybody likes to say 1,000 yards, but let's say 700, 800, 900 yards. I'll do 6 millimeters just fine. That's what most of us shoot. 22s, good 22 fast cows with good bullets are just fine. 6.5s are just fine. If I go to a big magnum, I do want the bullet to be as damaging as possible. So I accept the meat damage that happens off of that if I take a closer range or higher impact velocity impact for the fact that I need it to work at the longest range. And it's not a case of, because this is the other thing, going back to that, we'll keep an ELDX or ELDM off an elk shoulder at close range. Well, that's only if you care about meat loss. They do get into the chest cavity the entire way and kill very quickly. It just damages a lot of meat when it does it.
Heavy for caliber / sectional density. Like, I don't think when I first heard those terms, like, oh, what does that mean? Like, how does that all tie together? Can you do a quick why that matters?
It only matters, well, like sectional density is, caliber versus weight, right? Length versus weight. And if you go back to the idea, like when we have to understand, I mean, I don't want to go off on another tangent, but it all ties into if we don't know how we got to this point with why there's so many things that are untrue with guns and terminal ballistics and scopes and all of it, we don't know how to get ourselves out of it. If you don't know how you got in a hole, you can't get yourself out. And you got to realize that modern guns are 100 years old. It's one lifetime, right? There is somebody alive right now that remembers when 30-30s were incredibly cutting edge, right? Maybe we're 5 years past that. But, You're talking like center fire, high velocity projectiles, late 1800s, 120 years. And when we talk about modern stuff with actually understanding what bullets do, jacketed bullets and lead and plastic tips and tipped bullets. I mean, remember the nodular partition was like 1948. You know, that's my parents' time. They were alive when that happened. So we don't have this, thousands of years of experience. We're relatively ignorant about this. We're young we're a young species in regards to this. So if you have bullets that were designed around 30-30 level impact velocities, right? So 2,000 feet per second, which was super high velocity at the time. And then all of a sudden the 30-06 comes out, or the 270 Winchester in the 1920s. So imagine going from 2,600 feet per second, 25 being incredibly fast, so you get a 270 Winchester at 3,000 plus. Some of those were 3,100 plus with a 130. One, that's not a heavy for caliber bullet. That's a light for caliber bullet. That's 130 270 is like a 140 30 cal. So thin jacket, lead core, and that bullet was built around a 30-30 Winchester impact velocities. Dude, at 3,000 feet per second, it is a 30 grain varmint bullet. I mean, it just splats, right? And so sectional density came out because that was what the bullets were. And I'm just using that as an example, that caliber and cartridge. But if I have a big varmint, if I have a varmint bullet, if I make it longer, which increases its sectional density, it has more bullet material to come apart, therefore allowing adequate penetration. Sectional density is nearly completely useless when you're talking about high weight retention bullets. I can start with a 200 grain bullet at 0 inches, and at 15 it be 1 grain. 200 grain didn't matter at that point, right? Or it's less. I can start with a 50 grain bullet at 0 inches of penetration, and at 20 inches of penetration, it still weighs 50 grams. Well, their sectional density is way different when they start, but their ending sectional density, how much of the bullet is left, is also way different when they start than when they end, in reverse, though. So if you're using copper, the answer is generally light for caliber unless it's a fragmenting type that legitimately does it. When you're using one with a high weight retention, light for caliber with copper because you need higher velocity to make those things work correctly.
Mm-hmm.
With bullets that lose weight, so cup and core jacket bullets with thin jackets, there's a lot of ways to limit expansion and upset so you get sufficient penetration. But when we're talking about this, if you look at match bullets sectional density, right, it's literally you just need enough bullet that it can fragment and still have enough weight to make penetration. And that's all sectional density is caliber and weight length.
Okay. So how about just like heavy for caliber? And we're like, why is that important? Why is a heavy for caliber bullet better than a light for caliber bullet in regards to what we're talking about?
So let's use your 6 mil. Okay, so we take a 6 millimeter and we do a 70. I think they make a 75 grain VMAX. So Hornady VMAX is construction wise identical. I mean, it's not identical, but it is in the exact same realm as a 108 grain ELD, 103 grain ELDX. There's slight difference there, but it's the same style and construction of bullet. The problem is when you shoot that 75 grain VMAX, it's not the weight or anything that's the issue, right? It's that it has a super thin jacket and it's a very small bullet. So when that thing penetrates and it's hitting at higher impact velocities at closer range because you can launch it faster. Again, at longer range, they cross, and the better BC bullet has higher impact velocity. But at close range, velocity limits penetration to an extent because it overexpands or fragments bullets. I don't want to say overexpands because there's no bad part to that generally, but it causes more fragmentation. Well, that 75 grain 6 mil, it only has 75 grains of bullet to do work. So if it's fragmenting at the same rate as the 108 grain bullet, it can't penetrate as deep because it has 40%, 60% of the weight. So it's missing 40%. So when we do that 75 grain, trying to go off of memory here, maybe 7 to 8 inches of penetration, at 3,000 or 2,800 feet per second impact, because you just fragment till the bullet doesn't even have the mass to continue penetrating. The 108 grain, if it's the same construction bullet, at 6, 7, say 8 inches, it's lost 75 grains of mass. but it still has, I mean, math in public, still has 40 grains of mass to go, 43 grains of mass to go. So it's got more bullet that it can lose, so it penetrates deeper. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's why, like, heavy for caliber, when a bullet fragments, you need weight. You need more bullet to fragment to get the depth of penetration, because you're using the quote unquote sectional density, but you're using the mass of the bullet that is fragmenting to make the penetration depth. You know, if I take that same 6 millimeter and I have a 20 grain bullet, well, imagine how flat that is, right? It's an 1/8 inch tall 6 millimeter thing.
Hmm.
It within an inch it comes apart. I mean, it fragments totally inside of a grape. Well, that isn't going to work on an animal. But if you increase it to 1/2 inch long and it's 75 grains or 50 grains, well, now you get 3 inches of penetration because it's got more mass to come apart. I'm being absurd here. Make it 6 inches long. Man, that thing will penetrate 50 inches or 80 inches or something stupid because it's got a lot of bullet before, as it's tearing the front of the bullet, it's got a lot of bullet to go.
Mm-hmm.
So heavy caliber, sorry, like, because I do get questions on this or people ask, that's like 75-ish grain plus in 22 cal, 105-ish plus grains in 6 millimeter, 130-ish grains, 125 grains in 25 cal, 150, 160 and 270, 200 plus grain. We made a big jump. 168, 170 grain plus in 7 millimeter, 200 plus grain in 30 cal, and like 270 grain plus in 338. A 75 grain bullet in a 6 millimeter constructed identically to a 224 caliber 22 cal 75 grain bullet. That 75 grain 6 millimeter bullet is not going to penetrate as deep. That's not going to have the ideal wound profile.
Okay. Yeah, that's kind of where I was trying to go with it. Like, why? Okay, well, why not just take a 7 mm and shoot a super light bullet?
Penetration depth.
It's penetration depth. Yeah.
Unless it's a solid copper bullet, right?
Sure. Yeah. But exact same bullet. Yeah, you take the exact same bullet. Why not just, oh, well, if yeah, the 108 works great in a 6 Creedmoor, then why don't I'm sure there's, I don't know exactly, but I'm sure there's a 100 grain-ish 6.5 bullet out there. Why not just shoot that? Right? Oh, I'll get the same performance. Well, that's not true. Yeah.
No, and that's a great example because Hornady makes both. So you take 130 grain ELDM, and that bullet goes below, say, 2,800 feet per second and below, right? Here's the interesting thing for people to realize is in the practical terminal range of bullets, the lower the impact velocity, the deeper bullets penetrate. It's because the frontal diameter is less. They're not upsetting as much. So a bullet at 1,800 feet per second almost always will penetrate deeper than that same bullet at 2,800 feet per second.
That's so counterintuitive to what you would just kind of immediately assume.
That's exactly right, right? So again, like what we talk about is bullet failure with any of the modern stuff we're talking about is always a failure to upset. It's almost always a failure that it doesn't upset enough to cause rapid incapacitation. Penetration depth is not the thing. Like, that is from shooting so many animals, and I'm also acquaintance and buddies and work with people that are also culling a massive amount of animals in Africa, New Zealand, etc. The issue is always the bullet doesn't cause enough damage. I don't know of anyone, not one example of legit cullers that actually kill that are like, man, I just didn't get a good enough penetration with this heavy for caliber match bullet. It's always like, dude, it penciled through. Like the wound channel, and they'll take pictures and you can't stick a pencil through the holes. And that's all bullets the problem. And so the smaller, penetration depth is frontal diameter with velocity and mass. So weight. So if I have a 1 pound object that's 1 inch in diameter hitting at the same speed as a 1 inch diameter 1/2 pound object, right? And the same width, the same velocity, just the weight of the item is less. The one that's heavier is going to penetrate deeper because it has more quote unquote momentum. Of course, it has more energy too, but that doesn't tell you what you need to know, right? So when you do this, like, in the smaller the diameter that frontal diameter gets, the less resistance is on the front of the bullet. So one of the reasons that we catch, dude, I've caught more AccuBonds a Nosler AccuBonds, which is a fine bullet. I have caught more of them than probably every other bullet I've ever shot combined. Maybe a Scirocco too. And the reason is that's not true. The old trophy bonded, the old bear claws, you can't buy them anymore. I haven't been able to buy them for 20 years. They were designed to create like 3-inch wide or 3/4 inch wide mushrooms, this rounded mushroom. So they would almost always get caught on the exit side skin. But of any of the modern bullets, you catch more AccuBonds than anything I have. And the reason why is they got a relatively wide frontal diameter that's round and soft. Well, when you look at like a Barnes or a CX, it's got a relatively wide frontal diameter when it fully expands, but it's a little bit sharper on the edges and it's not filled in. It's got the petals, right? So it doesn't, the actual frontal diameter total is less than that expanded high weight retention lead bullet. But you still catch more of those than you do something like a Nosler partition, which is the front of the bullet fragments heavily, kind of like your Badlands. And what you're left with is just this wad cutter, flat nosed, caliber sized diameter projectile. Well, that's a lot easier to poke through the exit skin than this 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch wide rounded mushroom. So it's funny because we get more exits, even with smaller guns, with really heavy for caliber, highly fragmenting match bullets than we do like bonded, high weight retention hunting bullets. And it's just due to the smaller frontal diameter. By the time they get to the exit side, it's just like that. It's fragmenting, but it's maintaining a relatively small frontal diameter.
There's like the people are coming to listen to 15 hours of this, not 3 hours of this to take it all in. They have to listen to like 5 times. There's so much in there.
It just, it sucks because again, it's just why is it we're talking about why don't manufacturers show ballistic gelatin shots? They have them. Well, I think that's being worked on, not by the manufacturers, but by a third party doing it correctly, because the information should be out there.
I also find it pretty fascinating that like an ELDX is pretty cheap, pretty readily available, and a great option. It was like there's all these fancy stuff and people clamoring to get stuff that's unavailable, and obviously that goes in cycles of availability, but the ELDX is obviously pretty standard out there, and it sounds like there's a good reason to use it quite a bit.
Oh yeah, I mean, like I said, I think if the amount of people that should be shooting animals at a range far enough where their bullets of any normal cartridge is dropping below 1,800 feet per second, man, I mean, that goes into hit rates and the reality of field shooting, but it's just not a thing, man. Like the dudes that should be taking 600-yard shots in the field on animals is, if you're not shooting thousands of rounds, I'd be real careful with that. For you guys, I mean, I talked to this with Mark. I said this a little bit with you, is like archers don't believe that 60-yard shots on animals are so easy that they can shoot 20 to 30 arrows a year and then go out and smoke mule deer bucks at 60 yards with a bow.
Mm-hmm.
Every archer I know that takes it even remotely serious is shooting thousands of arrows a year.
Yeah.
Every 10 yards with a bow, having done both at a relatively high level, every 10 yards with a bow is at least as bad as 100 yards with a rifle.
At least.
Yeah.
At least. Like, I would actually, like, I can tell you it takes far less shots. I don't mean this in any way. It takes far less shots for me with a modern compound and adjustable sights, double peeps and the whole thing, to hit 8-9 inch targets consistently above 90% at 100 yards with a bow than it does hitting a 10-inch, 10-inch target with a rifle at 1,000 yards. Neither one of them should be done by very many people. Everybody always likes to think they're that person, but it's kind of like, man, if you're not breaking limbs, you're shooting so much, you probably ought not be taking 100-yard shots on animals. And, the other thing just from this is that you could get the idea that I believe in long-range hunting on animals, and I don't. I'm not saying I don't do it. I'm saying if you're not wearing multiple barrels out a year, I'd be real careful what shots I thought I can take on demand. Mm-hmm. So in that regard, when you look at an ELDX, it kills great. In all the legitimate functional terminal range of bullets, that bullet kills great, and it's super available. And Hornady Precision Hunter ammo or Same thing can be said for ELDMs of like weight. They kill almost identical, but they shoot good in most. They shoot well in most guns, and they're available. There's nothing. We don't have to make it any more difficult than that.
Well, I know, Form, that we're going to have questions from the audience. I know that Steve and I have other topics to get on. Obviously, we've spent a whole afternoon with you today and certainly appreciate it. But hopefully there's more to come, man, because even though I've had some of these conversations with you offline, I still learned a ton and I'm walking away from this with like new thoughts, different thoughts, challenging assumptions, and that's all I wanted out of it, right? Like, is just critical thinking.
We're all better when we're challenged.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that is a wrap, guys. Once again, if you visit the Experience Project link in the show description, you can find a summary of some of the key takeaways, links to additional resources, and more. And if you have any questions for us, we can consider those for a future follow-up Q&A episode. Let us know by sending an email to experience@exomountaingear.com, or that contact link will also be at the Experience Project website with the link in the show description. And finally, if you haven't yet, be sure to hit subscribe or follow in your podcast app so that you receive future episodes automatically, and we'll talk to you soon.